Introduction by Michael Schmidt to the first International Raw Milk Symposium at the University of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Michael is in court in Newmarket, Ontario on charges of distributing raw milk to cowshare owners.
This symposium, the idea of the symposium was born quite a while ago, but it was actually manifested itself just about 4 weeks ago when we were trying to debate what is happening with these court procedures and what if the court decides they take much longer so that we would not be able to call our expert witnesses and men flying from all over the world. And then we said, we'll put on our raw milk symposium because we can expound completely on issues which cannot be raised in the courtroom because it might be too widespread what actually the issue is here. Kathleen, rightly so, expressed herself that this is not really about raw milk. It is made out to be about raw milk. When you listened yesterday in the courtroom, and it was so clear that the expert witnesses from the other side testified on record that pathogens, these strange bacteria which basically endanger our being here in Canada, are present everywhere, in every food, and the only thing they do is they have pasteurized milk because it is clear, it is a commodity, it's looked at it as a commodity and not as a living food, and there's a lot of money to be made. I'm not saying be calling experts here. As you might recall, experts were used to make you believe that the U.S. can invade Iraq. Experts were used to fluoride our water. Experts were used to get GMOs approved. So what I would call our people who are coming here to testify in front of the public court here, these are people with knowledge. And these are people who do not pretend that they have to tell you what to do, but to inform you what your responsibilities are in respect to be informed and to know what you eat. It was interesting to see that the evidence provided by the other side was, and I was holding it up in court, were documents, they had to prove their case, I think it was 10 inches of documents they provided to prove that raw milk is not safe. And I talked with Ted and Ron about that, and then they said there is no reason to believe that science, that truth is based on the amount of paper you present. The truth can stay on it, can basically stay on its own or be on its own. And therefore, it was an interesting thing how and I used the words in the opening statement to the judge, if you need to prove your case, like bombarding a judge with papers to prove that raw milk is bad, it's comparable to how the U.S. bombarded Iraq in order to prove their case that there were weapons of mass destruction. There are, and it's only a gradual difference. I can tell you it's only a gradual difference. We have literally a war here towards the individual liberty of every person to make decisions based on their own consciousness. And I think we need to be very clear the belittling of the issue that is only about raw milk and that we are kind of, Birkenstock culture here, has nothing to do with it. We tried for a dialogue for so many years with officials, with government officials, with the university, and they are refusing to take part in these discussions. I really hope that in the audience there are some people from public health and some people from the University of Guelph and other universities who deal with public health, so that at least a dialogue can be started. This is about property, this is about individual rights. And I think we need to understand that in order to zero down what our theme today is, and it's only partially to help you to understand that what we are asking for is nothing else than our individual choice to life. Thank you.
Of Pathologist and University of Michigan Medical School faculty alumnus Dr. Ted Beals, whose studies focus on the biological benefits of milk and quality maintenance of fresh, unprocessed farm milk. Dr. Beals received an enthusiastic round of applause from the audience in the courtroom after he gave his testimony. Whereas otherwise the court audience is as quiet as mice, Ted Beals gave the following statement to the court. 1. Theodore F. Beals, being of sound mind and body and duly sworn, do hereby make the following statements based on my personal knowledge and to the best of my information and belief. 1. I am a resident of Grass Creek, Michigan, USA. 2. I earned my Bachelor of Science, Masters of Science, and MD from the University of Michigan in 1956, 1957, and 1966, respectively. 3. I have been licensed to practice medicine in the state of Michigan since 1967. 4. I completed specialized residency training in pathology at the University of Michigan in 1971. 5. I am certified in anatomic pathology by the American Board of Pathology. 6. I have written a book on pathology and have written several chapters in other books on pathology. 7. I have published more than 80 peer-reviewed articles on medicine, microscopy, essays, cancer, and cytopathology. 8. During my career, I have been a member or officer of more than 20 professional organizations. 10. I have taught pathology to medical and graduate students at the University of Michigan for 30 years. 11. I have practiced pathology and administered the clinical laboratories at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. 12. I served in the Senior Executive Service of the Department of Veteran Affairs in Washington, D.C. for 8 years. 13. I have testified several times in courts of law and as an expert in pathology. 14. A true and accurate copy of my professional curricula vitae is attached as Attachment A. 15. As board-certified pathologist, I am qualified to investigate disease and make diagnosis. 16. In the context of milk for human consumption, my experience in pathology also deals with microbiology and cellular aspects of disease. 17. Based on my professional training, education, and experience, I will be offering testimony on the topics outlined below. A. Milk is inherently a highly nutritious and healthy food that should be as important a component of the general public diet. Milk has historically and continues currently to contribute to the public health and safety. B. There is no food that is absolutely free of risk to the consumer. Further, there is no way to eliminate all foodborne illnesses from the consuming public. To set standards based on totally eliminating foodborne illness or based on a principle of zero tolerance is unsupported by scientific principles in general and public health science in specific. C. Scientifically and in practice, the most effective way to minimize risk of infectious disease transmitted through consumption of milk is by eliminating the known sources of bacteria that cause illness in humans from the farm and dairy operations. Such sources include cows which are shedding such bacteria, milk handlers that are shedding such bacteria, and the environment. D. It is unnecessary to use procedures to kill bacteria in milk that is to be consumed fresh by the general public unless it is known to contain adequate numbers of bacteria that will cause illness in the consuming public. I think this is my aside, here is the concern to have the dairy farming operating in clean and healthy circumstances. That's my aside. Continuing, E. When a consumer obtains food directly from a farm, the general public is not involved. The responsibilities for the qualities of the food, both beneficial and adverse, are fully vested in those two parties. Therefore, there is no role for government in such a transaction. Pathologist and University of Michigan Medical School faculty alumnus Dr. Ted Beals, whose studies focus on the biological benefits of milk and quality maintenance of fresh, unprocessed farm milk.
Is to give you some of the items that we testified before the court in Newmarket. Now, my opening opinion for the court as an expert witness was that milk is inherently a highly nutritious and healthy food that should be an important component of the general public's diet. It is a complete food and provides the total source of nutrition and water for newborn mammals during a most critical and active time in their development. Milk has historically and continues currently to contribute to the public health and safety of our population. I cannot imagine that anyone wishes to argue against that statement. In the 4 to 10 inch thick documents submitted by the Crown, there is actually nothing that refutes that statement in my affidavit. How did we get here? For some of you, this may be well known, but for some of the rest of you, it may be worth briefly going over history. Throughout human evolution, milk consumption has given people a competitive advantage. Milk was nutritious, perhaps one of the most thoroughly nutritious food people could consume. Milk was easily obtained, and the animals that were the source could be transported as people migrated. Scientists are now beginning to unravel the beneficial role of milk in immunity, our resistance to infectious disease, and there will be many more benefits as scientists look. One of the things that scientists are now learning is how much of that competitive advantage of milk have to do with the milk's natural microflora, both the organisms themselves, their activity, and the products that they produce. The more we look, the more we understand about the relationship between people and their personal microflora, in their intestine, on their skin, in their mouths, and almost everywhere else. It's extremely complex, and it is vital to our health. And because of the persistent use of milk in the diet of many people of the world, we and our associated microorganisms have developed some incredibly important and interdependent mechanisms for our mutual survival. This has happened because the consumption of milk conferred significant competitive advantage. What happened to this? When people began to congregate in large numbers in urban areas, there was a need to change the way people obtained their milk. People had obtained milk from their own domestic animals and from their neighbors. These animals produced lots of milk. It was consumed immediately. But with urban development and the popular belief that the industrial model allowed economies of scale and more efficiencies, dairy shifted from a personal and farm-based model to reliance on large, confined herds, cheap feed, and a goal focused on the volume of crop. It was a centralized model which required transportation over long distances. There were extremely unacceptable consequences of this change in the dairy operations. People were refusing to drink the milk because it spoiled. Pasteurization, introduced for wine producers, was able to prolong the time before spoilage of milk. And by extending shelf life, these industrial dairy operations were able to get milk processed and distributed to their customers. It's important to understand that although the proponents of pasteurization were extremely successful in marketing pasteurization for its safety, it was really about shelf life and ensuring that the product would not spoil before it came to the consumers in their home. Now, Ontario's laws prohibiting the sale of milk that was not being pasteurized were enacted in a highly political environment, a time when the public and the scientific communities had been participating for decades in a vigorous debate on the facts and the public interest surrounding what was commonly referred to as the milk problem. It followed a time when the public was faced with the realities of tuberculosis, typhoid, and diphtheria. The medical community in this area and throughout North America frequently were seeing in their clinics often children with diseases that were apparently associated with the distribution of this commercial milk. The debate was passionate with innuendo and misinformation, and one of the most powerful tactics used at that time in their rhetoric was that people should be afraid of germs. Since then, the proponents of pasteurization, that is, since they sort of won the battle by getting a majority vote and getting these laws passed, the proponents of pasteurization have kept repeating their rhetoric over and over again until it has become what we call dogma. And the controversial side of this was just simply swept away. But they are still signaling the alarm bells. Pathogens will kill you. And if they don't kill you, they're going to kill your babies. Even yesterday in court, we heard this very same alarmist quote. The Crown's witnesses make a convincing argument that milk has been studied in Ontario and the United States and that it should be pasteurized prior to consumption. But as a health professional and as a risk manager, I believe that there is a far more relevant question. And that question is, should the public be denied the right to obtain fresh, clean, unprocessed whole milk? That's a natural. No matter what the original intent of that language, the truth is that nearly all the rest of the world has now found it necessary to make the same prohibition. As a health professional, I testified that this flat prohibition against fresh natural milk cannot be justified on the basis of the need to protect the general public and the well-being of the public. The numerous states in the United States and the other countries around the world that do not flatly prohibit the sale of fresh natural milk are not ignoring their constituents' health and well-being. They must be cognizant of their responsibility, and they simply acknowledge the historical and scientific fact that it is possible to provide to the general public milk that is nutritious, that contributes to the health and well-being of their population, and is fresh and remains unprocessed. It is obvious, but it really does need to be repeated, that if milk had been hazardous to the individuals and the communities that were consuming it, the drinking of milk would have died out a very, very long time ago. can try all kinds of ways to reduce the numbers of harmful pathogens that the scientists have been finding. But no matter what we do, there's always this problem of collateral damage to the food. That is true of radiation of lettuce and pasteurization of almonds and a lot of other foods where they are trying techniques to reduce the number of harmful bacteria. One of the points that I made before the court was that the tried and true means of minimizing the risk of food spreading virulent organisms is to eliminate the source of the contamination. The two most obvious achievements in this regard in both Canada and the United States are the eradication of bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis. During the period of 1890s to early 1900s, when the intense public and media debates about the milk problem were raging, there were examples of tuberculosis and brucellosis associated with the distribution of milk that was coming from the enlarging commercial and industrial dairies were the star examples that they used by the advocates of pasteurization. History, however, documents that both of these severe public health threats had already started decline before pasteurization was even introduced by the industry. These diseases continued to decline with the advancement of medical knowledge and public health efforts, but not because of pasteurization. During this period, the most frequently legislative controls over the milk production included dairy inspections, bacterial monitoring, and the requirement that dairy cows be tested for tuberculosis and removed from the milk production if reactive. The victory over the two threats was actually ultimately realized when cattle infected with these bacteria were totally eliminated from both herds, eliminated from the herds by an intense government test and kill program. Despite the elimination of the two most notorious diseases associated with milk by means other than pasteurization, the Crown's witnesses keep repeating in numerous paragraphs and in their conclusions that their assertion is that pasteurization is the only effective way of protecting consumers from pathogens. I'm aware that you've probably heard that microorganisms present in fresh milk are contaminations from manure. Let's talk a little bit. They like to say this because it sounds pretty bad. Bacteria present in human breast milk have been studied very extensively. There's no doubt that the microflora in breast milk from healthy mothers is critical to the development of the intestinal microflora of the suckling newborn. These bacteria play a critical role in the newborn's developing immune defenses and in the establishment of the necessary microflora for their intestines. But it is also well documented that the microflora in the breast milk from healthy mothers is similar to the mother's intestinal microflora itself. Now, there's a debate among a few whether this is because of contamination of the milk from mother's feces, to be pretty blunt, or it's a natural colonization of the tissues of the nipple by these beneficial bacteria, or as some speculate, that the bacteria are actually migrating from the intestine to the mammary glands. I just want to make the point that the source of bacteria is not important. We can call them contaminants, colonizers, or translocutions. The point is they are present in the suckling milk, and they are critical to the developing immune system in the microflora of the intestines of the babies. We know that cow's milk contains many of the same bacterial types and undoubtedly play the same role. Now, one of the arguments made by the Crown's witnesses is that large numbers of well-designed studies of raw milk have demonstrated repeatedly that bacteria commonly called pathogens are present in that milk. Both Dr. Griffiths and Dr. Wilson, these are the two eminent scholars who were the witnesses and will continue to be the witnesses from the Crown. They have even personally participated in some of these studies. I would add that in the published reports of the studies of farm tank raw milk, the dairies providing the samples were regulated and were in all cases considered to be fully compliant with regulatory hygiene and bacterial standards of pathologist, I found it extremely puzzling that in some of these studies, the researchers report that the farm families were drinking from the same milk that yielded these bacteria. These families, they visit neighbors, they attend church, they go to community activities, their children even attend school. However, contrary to the picture that was painted by the Crown's witness, these families are not carrying disease into the community, infecting all those contacts. If this had been the case, we would certainly be hearing about a massive public health threat of dairy farmers, and there would be legislation to ban them from contacting the community.
Milk was just the start of that movement, and Mark, I think, started to look at that. I think it was wonderful to hear, and it warmed my heart when I listened to Ted and Ron this morning, because they have put together artfully, I have to say, a piece of art which they wanted to present at the courts. At the court level, you can't present a piece of art. They just want to hear facts. But it was so beautiful put together by Ted this morning and then Ron afterwards, to present the whole story of what it is all about. And since it is, you need to look at the world in a whole picture and not through the microscope as a scientist, because you will, if you want to find pathogens, you will find them everywhere. If you want to find the goodness, you find the goodness. And this is what I want to send you off with that thought. Look for goodness in the world. If you look for goodness in the world, to stand strong and resist is not a problem. And we will move forward and we will be successful. I think in another 2 years, the world will look very different because of this battle which we have taken on. And it is a wonderful journey together with you. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this information, won't you consider supporting Rabbit Hole Central TV, an ambitious project of the Concordia Foundation? Snail mail donations gratefully appreciated. The Concordia Foundation, 26 Gramercy Park, 7H, New York, New York, 10003, or Rabbit Hole Central TV, hit the donate bar. But this method costs more. Also, since I don't like PayPal, I don't think it works outside of the U.S. until I get some tech-savvy personnel.
Now, for the past 5 years, my wife and I have switched from drinking commercial grade A milk, which is what we have available in the stores in Michigan, to consuming more than 3 gallons per week of what we in Michigan call fresh, unprocessed milk. My wife, Peggy, who's a registered nurse, has written widely and a widely used consumer guide to safe handling of fresh, unprocessed milk. And I have devoted years to understanding the benefits and risks of this dairy product, using the best science available and our best information. In the context of our extensive careers as health professionals and a commitment to making food choices based on nutrition and health considerations, we currently drink only milk obtained fresh and unprocessed, directly from farmers that we know personally, from farms that we visit regularly, from cows on pasture, using procedures designed to minimize risk of pathogens, and with routine on-farm testing. We are pleased, as I'm sure many of you are, that we know our farmer by his first name. I'm sort of giving a look that we actually get milk from 2 different farmers, and we know both of them very well. They know us by our names. We would have no trouble whatsoever. And it is very pleasing and very interesting that these dairy farmers are openly inviting us to come and look at how they manage their farms and how they milk and how they process their milk. In those dairies using the cow share model, the consumers of the farm fresh unprocessed milk are extremely well identified because for the most part they obtain their milk through signed contracts with the dairy and families obtaining milk on specific days. Let me divert for a minute and let me talk briefly about what is destroy human pathogens in milk. It is the physical heating of milk primarily to reduce the number of bacteria that might be present in the milk. The primary commercial incentive for this treatment to reduce the number of bacteria is to increase the time before the milk spoils and becomes unmarketable. It is, in fact, to increase shelf life. It is a historic fact that the use of commercial pasteurization was often even hidden from the public by those early industrial dairy farms, dairy plants, because the heating of milk was generally held to be a bad thing, and it changed the taste of the milk. Don't we know that? The widely acknowledged reason that it was used is that it was the most practical way to keep the commercial product from spoiling before it actually reached the consumers. It extends the shelf life. All of the current acceptable forms of pasteurization are still considered by the industry as the most practical way to prolong shelf life, and even further now than it was at that time. The significant difference, in fact, of the current types of pasteurization is not safety. It is how long the shelf life is extended. Making milk healthier was not then, it is not now, the principal industrial value of pasteurization. What really astounds me is that since the widespread use of pasteurization, there are many highly lucrative businesses that have risen for the purpose of adding back things that were removed or damaged by pasteurization. Probiotics are in great demand by a growing health-conscious public. These businesses know what pasteurization does. I am personally aware of no evidence that milk from the farm in this trial has ever contained any pathogen organisms capable of causing illness in consumers, and have found no evidence of illness in the many consumers of this milk. And the consumption has been going on for many, many years. I can say this because unlike the general public, where the sale is retail and you never really know who it is that's getting the milk, from this farm it goes to a specific set of consumer families. We know who has been drinking the milk, and the fact that the farm fresh unprocessed milk goes out to a highly defined consumer population makes the risk assessment of this product unimaginatively easier to study. One of the strongest arguments in the New Market case is that Ontario is an outlier with their total prohibition of milk that is not pasteurized. Many developing countries allow this hazardous food, and interestingly, there are no statistics that indicate that there's causing severe public health crises in those countries. Children are not dying, as some in the Ontario agencies have warned. In fact, in some countries, in their program to encourage food in schools, there are milk dispensers, and would you believe it? Some of these milk dispensers have a side for pasteurized milk and a side for unpasteurized milk. So the school children are able to decide which of these two products they want to consume. There are several key topics that I brought before the court in addition to our position on the number of benefits of consuming unpasteurized milk and the dangers that pasteurization causes. In the United States and Ontario, there's a vigorous coordinated campaign to stamp out the growing number of dairies that are providing fresh, unprocessed milk directly to customers. I will leave to others to talk about the motives for this. The principal public and legislative argument at this time is that milk that has not been pasteurized is hazardous to the public. Again, I will leave to others to talk about the variations of this argument. Finally, the principal basis for the claim that this milk is dangerous is that repeatedly and consistently raw milk is found to contain pathogens. I want to spend some time this morning to talk about two general topics that I presented to the New Market Court to counter this campaign. Milk is milk. How often have we heard that? And it was presented in the line of evidence that said, oh, that's a good sign. Oh. It was me, not the equipment. As a scientist, particularly one who has spent his life testing specimens, The difference between the findings, I missed a sentence as we just got. When I talk with dairy farmers across the country and ask them about testing of their milk, increasing numbers are saying that they have been testing for pathogens and they're not getting back positive results from their labs. There are large numbers of them, and they're growing in the number of specimens in the years that have been being done. As a scientist, particularly who is one who spent his life testing specimens, the difference between the published data on pathogens in raw milk, which the Crown has, and I don't dispute that the data is pretty darn solid, and my observation of the test results of the dairies that I know, these are real differences. But the sampling is the same, the testing equipment is very similar, and the labs are really similar, so it narrows down to the milk. But I question whether the product tested in the list of findings describing the raw milk, which was presented by the Crown's witness, is the same product from the dairies that I've examined. I don't know precisely what the difference is, but there is an obvious characteristic that distinguishes the two products. The raw milk was produced in dairies that are licensed to provide milk for pasteurization plants and are specifically banned from providing that product directly to human consumers. To aid in this distinction for us this morning and for others, I prefer to call this pre-pasteurized milk. And the milk from the contrasting dairies, the ones that I'm finding do not have positive pathogen tests, and their results, these dairies produce milk specifically for immediate human consumption. To be precise, it is milk that is produced specifically to be consumed fresh and unprocessed. And I prefer to call this farm fresh unprocessed milk. Interestingly enough, when I presented the judge with these two contrasting pieces of evidence, he got interested in this as well. And quite frankly, it did appear that he was curious as how this is going to be explained. And when I pointed out that we were actually talking about two different products, he sort of looked alert and sort of interested. Now, the second point of concern that I presented to the court had to do with the word pathogens. A casual reading of the affidavits from the two expert witnesses appearing for the Crown leave the impression that bacteria and pathogens are essentially the same thing. Because of this sloppy terminology, I presented to the court a discussion about pathogens. And I hope at this point I don't get so technical that you all get starry-eyed. And if I do, just sort of raise your hand and I'll get off my medical school lecture podium and get back to reality. I'm going to focus on bacteria because there are other pathogens that aren't bacteria, but I'm going to focus on that. And I'm going to focus on those pathogens that are related to human disease. They're the ones I personally know as an expert. And particularly those that are associated with foodborne illnesses, and even more specifically the ones that we know about that have been reported associated with raw milk. As I pointed out to medical students, it's fortunate in preparing for examination that the list is actually reasonably short. Whereas the list of all the bacteria that do not cause illness in humans, some of them even beneficial, even essential to our well-being, it's huge. And very interestingly, the vast number of bacteria that we have not even been able to characterize and haven't yet given names is even greater than the number that we've already given names to. This is well recognized by everybody in the world of microbiology. The difficulty that I present to the court and to you is that in nearly all cases, the characterizations that have been used to distinguish different named bacteria have nothing to do with their ability to cause illness in people. The characteristics that are used to name the bacteria are usually the nutrients that they like, the environmental conditions that they grow best in, and the kinds of products that they produce when they're doing their thing. naming of bacteria is conventionally done with two parts, a two-name part. They have a genus name and a species name. Examples would be Listeria monocytogenes. It's interesting to see some people having a very hard time tripping over that word, and for some of us it comes off so very easily. The design is that the two-name designation would be adequate to allow microbiologists to be sure that they were talking about the same thing. The naming is not chiseled and branded. There's a constant acquisition of new information. Things like what I said to the court, and that is the designation as a pathogen is not a synonym for those two-name distinctions. An analogy may help you. It is possible to define a group of people as Scandinavians. I hope there aren't any Scandinavians in the audience that I'm going to make angry. And it could be that there were a set of carefully determined distinguishing characteristics that would enable you to reliably determine if somebody on Earth belonged to that group. Now, over time, people are murdered, and someone notices that in some of the murderers, the person proved to be they had the distinguishing characteristics of a Scandinavian. Now, no logical person would conclude that all Scandinavians are murderers. And furthermore, it doesn't even follow that the Scandinavian person who actually was proven to cause a murder would go around murdering everybody that they encountered. The point is that pathogens are really like this. Scientists studying infectious diseases have repeatedly found that within any specific two-name bacteria, for example, Listeria monocytogenes, there are actually large numbers of different subtypes. And not surprisingly, different scientists using different tools examining these bacteria find different subtypes of subtypes. And there are actually international committees that get together routinely that try to make sense of all of this, and they define subtypes and they give them names and they do other kinds of things. One of the other things that's happening is that as the scientists are recognizing these subtypes, they're generating databases. And in those databases, they are making a notation, this particular subtype was isolated from a person who had disease. This one was isolated from an animal who had disease. And this one was isolated from an environment. And interestingly enough, they begin to fall into categories, and they don't overlap. So in fact, some of these subtypes are ones that are what we would call virulent pathogens. Some of them are not virulent pathogens, and some of them are virulent under different conditions. One example may help you, because I know some of you will know this. The bacteria with the two-named abbreviation E. coli is almost everywhere in our environment. They're extremely important in our digestive system. And a few subtypes of them, one which is particularly in the literature is E. coli O157H7. And it's been isolated from people with diarrhea. The terminology is parsed out as number 157 in the subtype O and 7 in the subtype H. If it becomes established in the colon, it can cause severe diarrhea and should be distinguished as a virulent form of E. coli. But in a sloppy and totally incorrect use of the term pathogen, people often actually simply say E. coli is a pathogen. That is really sloppy, it's really wrong, and this is an incorrect term. The Crown's witnesses have used this sloppy terminology, and when they start blaming groups of bacteria for human disease, it's essential that they be a lot more precise. Truly virulent forms of bacteria are not everywhere. They are fortunately extremely rare. The Crown's witnesses presented numerous references and pointed out in their affidavits time and again that pathogens are everywhere. Specifically, they're everywhere in milk. This is, in fact, sloppy terminology. And they compound this sloppy terminology to reach the unwarranted conclusion that therefore people consuming milk will become sick unless the process of pasteurization kills all of those deadly pathogens. Flawed logic, because not all milk contains pathogens, Not all bacteria labeled as pathogens are going to cause people to become sick. And finally, flawed because pasteurization does not guarantee that milk will not cause disease. Their affidavits, in fact, document many incidents of foodborne illness resulting from the consumption of pasteurized milk. In the United States, the most recent deaths associated with milk consumption are from a dairy that was fully licensed with very good credentials that was producing pasteurized milk. Let me comment very briefly about a contrast between the dairies that are producing what I call pre-pasteurized milk and the dairies that I am referring to as producing farm fresh, unprocessed milk. We know, I don't have as much experience with them, but we know they have large herds, they are confined, they tend to be kept indoors, they're fed the cheapest available, most efficient grain that's possible. They're milked very efficiently, they lead very short lives, they sort of live in their own manure, and they are very crowded and mixed together. This is in stark contrast. One other thing that they do, by the way, which is very common, is that they pool the milk from neighboring farms when they are transporting their milk. My observation of the conventional dairy farms, the traditional dairy farms that are producing milk that's intended specifically for human consumption. These are farmers who look to their soil to make sure that there aren't any deficiencies and that they correct any of them. They look for sustainability of their soils. They plant the best forage in their pastures. They get their pastures in the most luxurious way. Many of them even rotate their herds from one pasture to another to ensure that the cows are consuming the very fresh and most luscious green forage that's out there. They have small herds. They tend to be in pasture as much as they can. They are not all that overly concerned about getting the maximum volume of milk out of their cows, and they're much more concerned about the quality of their cows. And interestingly enough, as I said before, these are farmers who are quite anxious and willing to have their consumers come and visit their farms and see how they're managing their farms and see the conditions that they're keeping their herds. They're transparent. I'll make a brief comment about some specific statements in the affidavits of the Crown's expert witnesses. I'll be very brief in this. In his affidavit, Dr. Griffiths, who's already testified, repeatedly applies a double standard when making his points. He acknowledges that milk, the milk I'm calling pre-pasteurized milk, contains pathogens and is a vehicle for foodborne illness. He even acknowledges that sometimes the market milk from this pasteurized product causes people to become sick. But he dismisses it as being sort of like not important. Then he repeatedly says to the court in his affidavit and in his conclusions about the hazards of what he calls raw milk, but what I'm calling farm fresh and processed milk. He persistently says, you've got to guarantee that your milk is absolutely safe, or you have to pasteurize it. Now that should be reasonably obvious, and I think the judge saw that that was pretty obvious. Let me comment about two other areas that I have a particular focus on that have to do. What we are hearing was that some of the people who would be avoiding dairy products meticulously because it caused severe abdominal cramps and diarrhea. These people found that if they drank fresh unprocessed milk, they didn't have this effect. Well, we were preparing a large scientifically designed questionnaire for cow-share participating families in Michigan, and so we decided that we would add a very short section on lactose intolerance there. ask questions. Now this went out and we got returns from slightly more than 2,000 members of households that are in fact under contract for house shares. In that group, there were 155, that's about 6%, that had been told by a health professional that their symptoms were the result of lactose intolerance. Interestingly enough, this percentage reasonably closely matched a randomized survey that was done by a national firm that does this professionally that asked exactly the same question away across the whole United States. So we realized that we had a reasonably interesting group, even though there's no doubt about the fact that our group was very biased. I mean, it went out to a very select number of people. It didn't go out to any controlled population. Anyway, of those 155 that had this diagnosis from a healthcare provider that they had the condition, 127, that's 82%, did not have their symptoms of lactose intolerance when they were drinking the regular process. No. And nearly all of them were drinking this milk regularly. This is solid evidence that the symptoms of this common condition are not present in a large percentage of people if they simply switch from commercial milk to unprocessed fresh milk. An explanation for this fact will need careful scientific analysis and research. However, I will agree with one of the witnesses when he made the comment in his affidavit, but lactose intolerance isn't cured by raw milk. And I agree, because in fact we had a follow-up question that said, okay, those of you who've had a professional diagnosis and are drinking milk and don't have symptoms, how many of you have had an occasion to fall back, if you will, and drink some of that other milk that you get out of a commercial dairy? And if you did, how many of you had symptoms? And it was remarkable that in the 70% range, if people accidentally or sometimes on purpose drank that other milk, their conditions came right back again. So it's not curing it. It's just altering the milk so that when the milk goes through their digestive system, the reduction in the amount of enzyme in their intestine is somehow or other augmented in such a way that it doesn't produce the symptom. Let me talk briefly about the asthma study. Dr. Griffiths, again, this expert witness for the Crown, dismissed the solid findings published in a series of papers from Europe and England that have established that children who drink farm milk that has not been pasteurized have a significant reduction in asthma and some allergies. The conclusions are scientifically solid based on analysis of several large controlled studies involving more than 15,000 children. The most recent of these publications addressed the specific question of whether the protection was associated with the consumption of unpasteurized milk or whether it was due to exposure to farm. And in this most recent publication, they made the statistical conclusion that it was not farm exposure, but it was in actuality the drinking of unpasteurized milk that is done. And interesting, another solid finding of the study is that if a child had drunk farm milk in their infancy, it not only reduced asthma and protected them against it, but it protected them against them in allergies as they grew old. The effect is fact. The future research will certainly be needed to explain the protective effect of farm fresh and processed milk. But unlike Dr. Griffith, who dismisses the findings because they lack an explanation, and interestingly enough, he brought up in his testimony, he didn't do it in his affidavit. He said, we're not really sure about this because we heard some rumors that some of those families that were getting the unpasteurized milk in this study were in fact boiling the milk when they got it at home and not telling anybody about it. I believe that the pursuit of details like what causes something is very important in science. But just the fact that you haven't figured it out yet doesn't mean it's
Presenters in
not
this
true.
first international raw
By the way,
milk
that study should not have been performed
are Dr. Ronald
except for a
Cole,
couple of
Australian
things. One of them is it had to be
microbiologist,
performed in a
university
country
professor, and food
where
consultant,
unpasteurized milk was not
co-author of
totally
several
banned.
books on
They
dairy
couldn't have done that in
microbiology, and
Ontario.
author of more than
Because there had to be a
30
very large number of people who were
on
in fact in their daily life
lactic
or
acid
were impacted.
bacteria, probiotics,
And interestingly enough, they did it in
to
schools
control disease.
where there were a fair number of people that were doing unprocessed milk, and they had access to them, and they could get their information. Does anybody want to make a guess as to what those schools happen to be?
Waldorf School.
They happen to be Waldorf Science School. There's a growing group of consumers that appreciate the quality of farm fresh unprocessed milk and are seeking out this product because they are convinced that it has many nutritional and health benefits. They want to know where their food is coming from and specifically know how the farmer makes management choices in providing their food. These consumers are willing to travel long distance to obtain the special product, and they pay actually a significant premium for what they see as enhanced quality. Furthermore, they're well aware that the product is not sterile. They know that many bacteria grow in the milk, their milk, under certain conditions. They know that farm fresh unprocessed milk contains beneficial bacteria that enhance their intestinal flora, their digestion, and their immune system. And not a few of them actually do this milk because they know this fact. They take particular care of this milk to retain its quality and until it is consumed. They are knowledgeable. They speak out strongly that they would like to be able to make their own food choices based on the weighing of the benefits and evidence. As a healthcare professional, I applaud these informed consumers. They realize that food is not just something that they get the cheapest and most convenient source, then dash through their meals so that they can get on to more important things. They appreciate that food is critical to the health and active lives, that the quality of their food choices have short and long-term consequences for themselves and their families. They do not trust the motives behind the commercial marketing and the push to have all of our foods thoroughly processed so that it can be provided in the most efficient and the cheapest way possible. And they see that government intrusion into their personal food choices is overly influenced by the industrial food giants. In summary, the question before the court is actually quite simple. Should the general public in Ontario be prevented by law from having access to clean, unprocessed whole milk? Or perhaps is the law justified in making a distinction between access to milk that has been pasteurized and access to farm fresh unprocessed milk? In describing the public health threats from what they call raw milk, the Crown's witnesses use page after page of documentation that raw milk has been shown to be hazardous and cannot be allowed to be consumed. The principal flaw in this picture is that although this may be true for pre-pasteurized milk, they have not shown that it is true for farm fresh unprocessed milk. The reason that they have not shown this is because their experience in nearly all of the published science has been examining pre-processed pasteurized milk. In my professional opinion, I said to the court, milk does not naturally contain pathogens. Simply because a pathogen is categorized as belonging to a group labeled pathogen does not mean that that specific bacteria will cause members of the public that are exposed to become sick. Pathogen hides a critical distinction between pre-pasteurized milk and farm fresh unprocessed milk. Let me say that I was actually offered an opportunity which was quite unusual. Michael asked me, in my experience, my professional, did I have any recommendations as to how to approach the problem that is so contentious in this country and specifically in this province? And I responded that I was personally aware of a process in which the various contentious groups were brought together, representatives were brought together to sit down together, talk together about their personal wishes, their personal concerns, and have these people charged with coming up with a practical, workable solution to how it should be possible for a consuming public that wants a fresh, natural product to be able to get that product. Interestingly enough, the judge listened. Interestingly enough, the Crown's attorney didn't object that was sort of outside of my professional expertise. Let me lead on to Dr. Hall, who may have a little bit of time to talk. And then, as I said, when we're finished, we hope we're going to have a little bit of time when we can answer your questions about what happened in the trial if they haven't been brought up by us.
Dr. Beals, he and I have been having a lot of fun in this court case. And hopefully the recommendation that Dr. Beals mentioned, that the two sides would sit down and talk, hopefully will come to fruition. Because in fact, the experts on both sides really don't disagree in science on this matter. It's just a matter of interpretation. The only area where we have a disagreement at this point in time, and I think it's a very minor disagreement, they say, the Crown says that it's not possible at this point in time to produce raw milk, they call it raw milk, and Beals redefined it as farm fresh, unprocessed milk as distinct from pre-pasteurization milk. They say it's not possible to produce farm fresh, unprocessed milk without risk to the public. We disagree with that for several reasons. The first, and I think the most important, is that many countries do it. We have sitting in this room Mark McAfee, who does it every day. So it is being done. And I believe, and I disagree with the Crown's witnesses, that it can't be done, because I personally believe and have seen it done, and I know the science as to why it works and why it doesn't work. If I'm talking a little slow, it's because maybe I'm an Aussie, but Ted and I stayed up rather late last night preparing for this presentation. I'm not going to deal any more now with the court case. I just want to present some information on why I believe raw milk is a safe food. I think there is, just before we leave the court case, there's a very much larger and wider issue here. I think my talk is the thing about milk, and I've got several meanings in that title. I'm going to talk about what it is in milk that makes it safe. But there's also the aspect of what's the thing about milk that regulators don't like, particularly farm fresh unprocessed milk. Why do they have a thing about milk? Because they don't ban any other raw unprocessed foods. At the moment, if you look behind you, you'll see that they're working on all of our fresh foods. And I think this is very unfortunate, because fresh foods really are very nutritious, and man needs fresh foods for health and nutrition. And I believe this is a real threat to future generations. I think it's more of a threat than a lot of the other things which the politicians talk about. And I think this is something that should be brought to their attention. Let me now turn to the topic of raw milk in this presentation. Raw milk, like all fresh food, is a live food. Its heart is those components of the milk, and particularly the white cells, the multitude of enzymes systems, and the lactic acid bacteria that are dear to my heart, which bring together the system that kills pathogens and gives life to the food. This is what makes raw milk the perfect food for the newborn animal, including humans. It's the only food that really establishes gut microflora, like as Dr. Beals said this morning. It's much better than infant formula or any other food man can produce at establishing immunity in the newborn. I think Michael Schmidt, see here, no, he's gone out to the car. He was going to get a sample for me. My next statement is simply this, that if you take farm fresh, unprocessed milk and set it aside at room temperature or at body temperature, and I'm sure many of you have done this, it's sour. It goes sour. And that product in the industrial world we refer to as cheese at room temperature, and at 37 degrees it's called yogurt. Now, how many of you knew that? Gee, usually when I ask that question I don't get any hands at all. That's terrific. So that product is safe to eat and drink or whatever. Perfectly safe. If we do the same thing with pasteurized milk, you know what happens? It's a bit like playing Russian roulette. Sometimes it may be edible and safe, but most of the time it's highly dangerous. And I've got a couple of examples of this. Michael's going to bring them in shortly. Now, if I can work this projector, I need some help. Okay, what are the factors in raw milk that produce, the two factors in raw milk that give us immunity are firstly the innate immunity and the lactic acid bacteria. I did these slides late last night, so I'm not really familiar with them. The innate immunity systems in milk are shown on this slide. And in the blue boxes you'll see a number of components there, big words, big scientific terms, but let's just look at them briefly. The first one on the left-hand side is white cells. White cells are those soldiers that run through our body and defend us from infection. The second one is a group of enzymes we refer to as complement. And the complement is a set of enzymes that work with those white cells to kill invading bacteria, control infection. Complement is very important to our immune system, our innate immune system. The third one is called lactoperoxidase, which is a complex enzyme system which kills a large number of bacteria, including pathogens. The fourth one is lactoferrin, which is another antimicrobial system in milk, and the fifth one is lysozyme. In the first column is the temperature at which those enzyme systems are killed or inactivated. The white cells at 45 degrees. That's why on a hot day, those are all Celsius, by the way. This is a Celsius country. 45 degrees, that's why if you don't cool yourself on a very hot day, your white cells and a lot of other things in your body cease to function above 45 degrees. Complement is inactivated at 56 degrees. We go to 82 degrees for lactoperoxidase is activated, and then not until 96 and nearly 100 degrees for those last two antimicrobial systems. They're very heat resistant. If we then ask the question, which of those survive in pasteurised milk, it's the last three. The first two are quite inactive in pasteurised milk. There's a list of microorganisms there, and whether the plus means they're killed by that system, the I means they're just inhibited, and a negative means no effect. So you see that of those systems, the most effective of those systems are the first three, and 2 of them are inactivated by pasteurization. So we've lost 2/3 of the antimicrobial activity of milk by pasteurization. Down the bottom I've got a term there, lactics, and they are the lactic acid bacteria. They are the bacteria that are used to make cheese and yogurt in the dairy industry, to make beer, wine, and fermented pickles and sourdough bread, and all those sorts of lovely foods which Big Brother's looking to have pasteurised as well, by the way. These organisms are used to make those ferment. They are not affected, so there's a row of negatives right across the board there. They are not affected by any of those systems in milk. So those organisms are present, remember in the second slide, in raw milk. They come from the mother, or the cow I should say, mothering cow, and they can grow in milk, but all of those pathogens, or those organisms from which we find the pathogen, are inhibited or killed. Now this is an example of some work done, and it's not new, it's old work, raw bovine milk, not only for drinking, but for cheese making as well. So we didn't have to pasteurize the milk to make cheese, as well as drinking. But it's a selective bag because I can drink goat's milk, raw goat's milk. So that doesn't make sense to me as a scientist, because why should I not get out and drink cow's milk when I can drink goat's milk without pasteurization? So that doesn't make any sense scientifically. This table shows that Listeria monocytogenes, you've all heard of, or Listeria, this is incubation time in hours on the bottom line, and if we look at the graph, which is the squares, I think it is, just the squares there. If we look at the graph, is it squares? Yes. You can see that Listeria monocytogenes inoculated in raw milk at around the number 4. And the number 4 is a logarithmic scale, so 4 means a 1 with 4 zeros after it, so it's 10,000. A 6 on that scale is a 1 with 6 zeros, so that's a million. It increases to nearly a million in the first 16 hours or so, but then it starts to die off, and by about 48 hours it's completely killed. If we look at the top graph, which is the triangle, that's pasteurised milk, there is some killing that grows to much higher levels, and the killing effect is much less. So raw milk kills Listeria much more effectively than pasteurised milk, but the key point is that the raw milk kills Listeria. This is the same experiment done with another pathogen, Salmonella enteritis, and the last, sorry guys, I'm leaning and talking. This last graph shows the same data with Staphylococcus aureus, another foodborne pathogen. So in each case, the raw milk actually kills these organisms. Now I mentioned also that raw milk contains lactic acid bacteria, and these organisms are used to make cheese and yogurt. They're in raw milk. What is the action of these organisms against pathogens? And I've listed here E. coli, Listeria, and Staphylococcus. And across the top in the blue column is the compounds produced by lactic acid bacteria. And the first one is organic acids. Organic acids are lactic acid, acetic acid, and so on. We know acetic acid is vinegar commonly, or lactic acid is the sour acid in milk products, yogurt for example. They kill all of those pathogens quite effectively. The next group of compounds are called bacteriocins, and they kill only the Listeria and the Staphylococcus, not the E. coli. And the alcohol is an abbreviation for alcohol derivatives, which are produced in products like kefir and the long-life cheeses, which we all love, and they are very effective at killing all of those pathogens. So the lactic acid bacteria produces large range of compounds, not only in cheese, and yogurt, but also when we ingest them in our intestinal tract. And this is an experiment that shows that there's one particular lactobacillus plantarum which is very effective at killing listeria, and that's the triangles. When these two cultures are put together in milk, the listeria dies off, the lactobacillus is at the top, the black and the squares at the top, that's the growth of lactobacillus. It grows very prolifically. The listeria, the triangles, in the presence of the lactobacillus, will open triangles, showing it dying off very rapidly. These are the interactions between lactic acid bacteria and pathogens, where the lactic acid bacteria dominate and the pathogens are killed off. And this slide is an example. The first most effective method is to immunise the population. We've eradicated smallpox from the population by immunisation. We can eradicate foodborne disease from our populations by immunisation. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by immunising? What it means simply is that we need to maintain constant supply of lactic acid bacteria in our diet. Ted Beals referred to that, the fact that companies are supplying probiotics, and they can see a great market there, but what we need in our diet is fresh, unprocessed foods, ferments, and fresh, unprocessed foods. And what you're here today for is raw milk, and raw milk is one of the oldest, safest, fresh, unprocessed foods. And it does just that. It immunises us against infection by pathogens. I'm going to skip it, so please turn that. Everyone's had enough, I think. I would just like to finish up and come back to the court case. I concur 100% with Dr. Beals that the warring parties, if you like, should sit down together and work out a way forward in this. It's not difficult. It's being done in California, and it's not difficult to do. And I implore the other side to do that. The other issue is that it's nice to see so many people interested in this issue, because I think it's, as I said in the opening slide, this raw milk is not the only food that's under threat. I think it's all about fresh foods and all about ferments. So many of them now are being pasteurised with the guise of protecting public health and safety. And I don't think it's a good way to do that. Thank you.
Milk was just the start of that movement, and Mark, I think, started to look at that. I think it was wonderful to hear, and it warmed my heart when I listened to Ted and Ron this morning, because they have put together artfully, I have to say, a piece of art which they wanted to present at the courts. At the court level, you can't present a piece of art. They just want to hear facts. But it was so beautiful put together by Ted this morning and then Ron afterwards, to present the whole story of what it is all about. And since it is, you need to look at the world in a whole picture and not through the microscope as a scientist, because you will, if you want to find pathogens, you will find them everywhere. If you want to find the goodness, you find the goodness. And this is what I want to send you off with that thought. Look for goodness in the world. If you look for goodness in the world, to stand strong and resist is not a problem. And we will move forward and we will be successful. I think in another 2 years the world will look very different because of this battle which we have taken on. And it is a wonderful journey together with you. Thank you so much.